Good morning. Hope everybody can hear me. I think we're actually ready to get started. Before I do, just a couple things up front. One, I'm John Kelvey. I'm the CEO of Bespoken. Thanks for joining us this morning or this afternoon if you're in Europe or farther than that. We are recording this webinar, so the webinar the replay will be available to you afterwards. Additionally, we will make the slides that we present available as well, so you don't have to worry about memorizing the things that I'm showing or taking screen caps. Know that we'll send that to you via email afterwards. Additionally, this is a webinar, so it's not totally interactive, but we try to keep our eye on the chat window and the questions window. And so if you have questions as I'm going through this, please do ask me, and I will try to answer them as they come up and try to make this at least somewhat interactive. Lastly, I'll just mention that we have the poll section. We have a few questions there. It's really helpful information for us. So if you have a chance, please do answer those. We do appreciate it. And so with that, I am going to get started. I'm going to share my screen here. And so we're talking this morning about QA for Alexa skills. What we're going to cover is we'll go through some introductions, talk about what we do a bit as a company, Bespoken. We want to give you an overview of testing and monitoring as a whole. And then we're going to do a deep dive into how we do QA and end-to-end testing. And then we'll talk about our continuous testing, which we also refer to as monitoring. Show you what we've done there, which we think is really neat, and then leave some time for questions at the end. And so just on this call is obviously myself, Bo Schrader, who's our head of marketing. She's in the chat window there. Yvonne Perez, who's our customer success lead, is also there. They can also interact and answer your questions in our webinar window. And so what do we do as a company? So we provide monitoring and testing tools for voice apps. We're a recognized vendor of Amazon and Google. We have over 900 apps that we're monitoring and over 2,000 developers. And we have a long history with speech recognition and AI. So I've actually, prior to Bespoken, I was the CTO of another company, and we had been really doing speech recognition on the mobile side. And really since 2013. And we had actually built our own speech recognition engine there. Even in building our own speech recognition, I would say we probably spent 10% of our time working on the engine and 90% of our time testing it. So now that we're actually working with Alexa and Google, where they're providing the engine, that number is really not changed that much. Instead of 90%, it's just 100%. So I'm glad that I'm able to use that experience that we built up testing the speech recognition and AI. And we do try to build that into our product. So on this slide is an overview of what testing and monitoring is, and just also generally the space for voice apps. Some interesting stats here, aggregate stats on the voice space and on Alexa. Hi, can you is the audio working there? All right, sorry about that, guys. I don't know what happened. I don't want to repeat myself a lot, but just covering that it's really 100 times cheaper to get a bug in the design phase versus production. So it's really good to be doing your testing from the beginning. And what does it mean to be testing from the beginning? Well, we think of testing in terms of this layer cake over here. And it starts with the manual testing, which it's pretty obvious how you do that. You're just working with either a real device or a virtual device. But it doesn't end there. You want to do your automated unit testing, and that's really about ensuring code quality. End-to-end testing, which is about testing your skill and your voice app as a whole with all, within the entire ecosystem. And then lastly, continuous testing, which I mentioned before, we also call that monitoring. But it's leveraging the work that you've done in these other testing stages to continue to test after your skill has gone live. So some more detail on what each of these stages is. Manual testing, this is about doing, just interacting with devices, talking to either an Echo or Google Home, using the Echo Sim or the Reverb app. You can also use our command line tools if you want to be able to test without having to use your voice. These are all really great ways to just get started, make sure your skill or your voice app is working correctly from the outset. But that shouldn't be the only thing that you do. We really strongly encourage people to do automated unit testing. We provide great tools for doing this. We've actually done another webinar that's really dedicated to unit testing, which we would encourage you to check out. And we'll probably do that one again in the future. But unit testing is really helpful because what this is going to do is it's going to ensure that your code is working correctly. And so it's about minimizing the dependencies that you have and making sure that your logic is correct. And so by isolating those dependencies, focusing on your code, you can make sure that what you've written is actually logically right. And if you're doing that, it gives you a few benefits. One, by building up a suite of unit tests, you can leverage those over time. So the unit tests that you write today, you can be running those a month from now, 6 months from now. Just checking the window over here. Okay, good. You can be leveraging that over time to ensure that your app is working correctly. And so you'll always have that as essentially a regression test against what you've built. That's immensely useful. Additionally, and sort of extending upon that, you can easily tie it into code coverage tools like codecov.io, which is really nice. And it basically presents back to you information about what you've written, which is really helpful. And so it'll show you graphs, it'll show you percentages, it'll show you really all the data that you need to know how your testing is going over time. And it's very easy to set those tools up, especially if you're using things like GitHub to store your code. Additionally, a lot of people think of unit testing as something that's happening right now, or something that is gonna give you benefits over time. But if you start using it right away, it's actually going to save you time in the development that you're doing that very day or very soon. And the reason why you're going to accrue benefits very quickly with it is you can set up complex sequences and unit tests that if you had to test it manually, if you think about a skill that has several steps to it, if you're testing that manually, you have to work through that sequence. And that can be very slow to do. Sorry, I'm just going to check the window there just to see what the messages are. Sorry, I kept hearing the little beep there. I just wanted to see if there were questions. So if you start using unit testing and putting that in place, you can work through a complex sequence, a complex interaction, essentially instantaneously, and debug it instantaneously. Whereas if you're doing it manually, you're interacting with the device, it's rather slow, it's error prone. Being able to create a unit test that allows you to skip to the 6th step in the sequence and immediately debug it, essentially instantaneously, that's going to save you a huge amount of time. And I like to think of this as, essentially a superpower that you have that's available to you as a developer that can make you a much more productive developer, as well as somebody who produces much higher quality work. So unit testing we see is something that's really essential. The other side of that is end-to-end testing. So end-to-end testing allows for speech recognition, testing the speech recognition as well as the AI. It allows you to test the entire system. So with unit testing, we really put the focus on testing your code in isolation. But when you're talking about system testing and end-to-end testing, you're really looking at the entire ecosystem. So you're testing Alexa, you're testing any other pieces of infrastructure that you have, like a database, if you're using S3. All of those dependencies go together. And with unit testing, you're ensuring your code works correctly, which is really important and great. But with end-to-end testing, you're ensuring that the system as a whole works for a user. And that's also obviously critical. Both pieces are really essential to building things with quality. And one thing I would particularly highlight, if you're doing end-to-end testing with voice apps, is you really do need to focus on testing the speech recognition. And so making sure that your interaction model works correctly. So the interaction model is basically your front end for your voice app. I think when you're initially putting these together, almost anyone, you're going to have some sort of glaring issues with it. Your voice app is going to misrecognize what's being said. It's going to match the utterances to the wrong intent. And there's usually a few glaring issues that, basically you're going to notice right away and you have to fix those. But there's often more subtle issues. And so doing end-to-end testing is really going to help you identify those more subtle issues over time. So they're both really critical to building great voice apps. And we're going to go into more depth on how exactly we do that in a moment. And so some of the special considerations you need to keep in mind when you're building for voice, when you're building for AI, one thing is these AI-based systems, they are constantly evolving. They're based on machine learning, which does mean that they're changing over time. It's not radical changes, but there are more subtle changes that can potentially disrupt the behavior of your skill. And so it's really important that you have a good testing regimen in place so you're not caught unaware by some change in the behavior of the speech recognition. That's a really important thing. Additionally, languages and locales. Internationalization has always been a challenge for any developer, but for voice, language is your interface. It's the only interface that you really have. Sometimes these devices have touchscreens, but you really, your essential input is people's voice, and it's what they're saying. So you need to make sure that it really works well for people, in whatever their native language is, and that your phrases, that your language interaction is natural. So testing for that, it's a different ballgame. So you need really good tools to do that. And then lastly, platform behavior. Today, I think almost everyone in the space is working with Amazon Alexa. There are many, many folks working with Google as well. Apple is less open to third-party developers, but that could really change at any time. And at that point, that becomes a very important platform for people to work on. And then lastly, Facebook, has been often rumored that they're going to enter this market. They supposedly were going to do it even a couple of weeks ago, but got distracted by some privacy issues. There's multiple different platforms that are out there, even more than what I'm naming, and people want to deliver apps that have consistent behavior across those. And the only way to really do that is again, to have a really great testing regimen. So those are all things that you need to keep in mind when you're thinking about developing for AI-based systems and for voice. So with that, I'm going to go into some more depth on what we do for end-to-end testing. I'm just going to take a look at the questions here. So Sammy, you asked, why is it specifically cheaper to find a bug in development as opposed to later on in the skills lifecycle? And I see Tobias actually provided an answer. In development state, it costs you only time. During life cycle, bug can cost you customers. The cost of customers is huge, but I would also just highlight, if you have a bug in production, at that point, it's going to be reported to you maybe through customer support. So it's taking up your customer support time. You've deployed it. So that means that you're going to have to do another deployment in order to ensure that it's actually to actually affect a fix, which if you catch it during design, there's no deployment. You're going to have a developer involved who may not be the person that originally worked on it, or maybe they worked on it 6 months ago and now they've forgotten about it, or maybe they're on vacation. You're going to have to go through a test cycle before it can be put out there, whereas you already went through your test cycle. And the test cycle isn't just specifically to check the fix, it's to make sure that you didn't break anything else. You're going to have to make potentially announcements around any impact on the other aspects of the product related to the bug. Essentially, once something is live and it's an issue, it has the potential to touch upon every part of your organization. And for every part of your organization, it's more complex to actually fix because of people just having forgotten about it or just not having, they're not at the ready to actually work on it as they were at the moment when they're initially developing it. So for all those reasons, it really becomes massively more expensive to resolve. And I think if you've gone through development cycles, you can pretty easily find examples, probably in your own experience, where that bears out. So for end-to-end testing, we have this very nice scripting syntax that we've put together. We initially had only a programmatic API for doing it, which we thought was great, but we set a higher bar for ourselves. We wanted to make it possible for anyone, not just programmers, to do really thorough, automated end-to-end tests. And so this is what we came up with. If you're not familiar with YAML, it's meant to be a very easy to use, easily readable syntax, even compared to like JSON or XML, very intuitive, and at the same time rather powerful. So we leverage this as the basis for our testing syntax. The way in which we use it, it's a very simple, or to pick on an easy case here, this is a conversation with Alexa. And in this case, it's actually just opening a skill and testing here on the right-hand side that the response is correct. So really easy to write that. And just to show you the skill that we're using to test this, I'm using this example. It's a shopping list skill called bring. And we use this because we think it's a very nice skill. It's also in several different localities and different languages. And so that also shows off some of the more complicated things that we can handle. But just to quickly demo the skill, open bring.
Welcome to Bring. How can I help?
What's on my list?
You have the following items on your list: milk, orange juice, French fries, bread and lemons. How would you like to proceed?
Add pretzels to my list.
Okay, pretzels is on your list. Anything else?
No.
Talk to you soon. Happy shopping.
So I demoed almost the entire functionality of the skill. There is one other thing that it does, which is you can remove an item, but it's just a simple list management skill. And so when we're writing automated tests for it, we basically work through the same sort of interactions. So in one case, I launch it and I test that it has the right response. And then in a more complex scenario, I launch it, test that it has the right response, and then just like I did in demoing it there, I then say, what's on my list? And then in this first interaction, all I tested was the audio response. But here, I'm testing the audio response, which is the transcript, and also testing what the card is. So hopefully this looks fairly intuitive, but we've actually created a much more complex test here. We're doing multiple steps, and we're testing multiple aspects of the response that our skill is giving. So then to actually run this, we have a command line tool for running it. To set that up, all you have to do is you type npm install Virtual Device SDK. Once you run that command, then you're set up to start using this. And if I want to run this launch request, I give it the name of my file. And this does not run quickly. We basically work at a similar speed that it's going to work in terms of interacting with it, just with your voice. But the nice thing is it's totally automated, so you don't have to sit there while it's going on. And so, for example, I can use this time to show you guys where this project is. So what I'm demoing today is actually all available on GitHub. We have a link to this in our presentation. And you can actually download this example, try it out yourself. And if you want to use it for testing your own skill, you just make a few modifications and you're off and running. It's very easy to get started and work with this. So meanwhile, this was running in the background. You'll see as it runs, it gives this detailed output around what happened. But then we summarize it at the end, and we see our first sequence, which is our first conversation with Alexa. It's opened it. It got a response. The response was correct. In the second case, it's red because the card was not set correctly. Now, this was actually an expected failure because we set up this test. We wanted to show how you would test a card, but this skill doesn't actually use cards. So it's always going to fail on that one. And so that gets highlighted in red. But we do want you to know that you can do this more complex testing around what's set on a card, what's set on a display interface. That's all possible with our testing syntax. Other things I would highlight here, if you look at this file at the top, we have this configuration element. And here you can set what the locale is. So here we're testing US English. And then we set a voice ID. And so, I've been saying this is an end-to-end test. What that means is that we're actually taking this text, we're turning it into speech, we're sending it to Alexa, Alexa sends it to the skill comes back with a response, we turn that back into text, and then we do this comparison. So hopefully it looks easy, but there's a lot actually going on under the covers. And when we're doing this text-to-speech, we're actually using Amazon Polly. And so Amazon Polly has a whole bunch of voices that are available here. And so this is a really useful thing. You can test with these different voices to get different accents, to get different genders, get different pronunciations, different languages, I should say, kind of obviously. It's a really useful tool for your tests. And we do find that your skill, based on the voice ID that you choose, you'll get different performance. And that's a helpful thing when you're trying to make sure that all the speech recognition is working, as well as you would like. Additionally, you'll see here, we have this whole project, and we have it divided into 3 folders: DED, ENGB, ENUS. And so these represent the different localities that we're working with. DED is Germany. This is English in Great Britain, and this is English US. And then within this, we subdivide it into different intents. So we have the launch request, add items, and remove items. Now you can divide this stuff up any way that you want. We think it's a best practice to create basically a test file for each of your intents within each of the localities. It's a nice way to organize things. It's not something you have to do, but having that organization is very useful for keeping everything nice and clean. And so to show you a skill in German here, it looks very similar. It's obviously not English. This is actually written in German. I don't speak German. I can sort of make sense of this. This is saying open. This is saying welcome. And we're actually leveraging some more advanced features here. So one, you see this dash. What this means, it represents a list, and that any of these values are acceptable. And that's a really useful thing. One of the best practices that's strongly encouraged for voice app development is to have variable responses so that it feels more conversational. And a simple example of that is when someone's done using your skill, sometimes you might say goodbye, sometimes you might say so long. You vary that response a little bit to make it feel a little more human, more conversational. That's a nice thing for users. And so you can accommodate that in your test by having variable responses listed in this collection. So that's a nice thing. Additionally, you can do wildcards. So this asterisk means any response that comes after, I'm not going to try to pronounce that word, but after this word here, will be accepted. So the wildcards are a nice way so that you don't have to specify everything. That's a useful thing. And so I'm going to go ahead and run this German example now. And you can run entire directories or individual files. How you want to execute this. If you're just doing sort of, like we're basically doing sort of ad hoc testing here. We're running things one by one. But if you're really tying this into a whole regression process, you're going to run all the tests at once. And you can do that by just specifying the directory. So as I run this, I'll just show you over here. Okay, I'm logged into the right one. So if I log into the Alexa screen, to my Alexa management web app or the app on your phone, you get this nice history. And so for the account that this test is associated with, I can actually see all the interactions happening. And that's a really neat thing. And so, Mark, that's a really great question. I'm going to come back to that when I show the sort of programmatic API in a moment, because I think we have a great answer to that. And I'll show it to you when we look at some of the code there. So here, all of our interactions showed up. You keep seeing these Alexa stop. So we actually explicitly say stop or quit to Alexa to make sure that the session closes out in between those test sequences, so that we make sure that we're opening the skill again fresh. So that's why you see that there, even though we haven't necessarily actually said that in the skill. But if I click on one of these, here's what Alexa thinks it heard for the test.
Sag mir, was auf meiner Liste ist. Sag mir, was auf meiner Liste ist.
So we can click on it and listen to it, which is kind of cool. And that's actually Polly that's speaking there. And we can also verify that what Alexa heard is what we actually said. And in this case, it does match up correctly. But this is really useful for debugging speech recognition issues, where you'll notice that there's actually a difference between what Alexa heard and what you intended for it to say. And that can help you in terms of tuning your utterances and catching sort of special cases. It's a really useful tool as you're working on these voice apps. And so it's very straightforward constructing these tests with this YAML syntax. You really don't need to be a programmer to do it. You know, any of you on here that want to test your apps, I think you won't have any problem getting started with this. So I do encourage you to just give it a try. But if you want to get into some more complex test scenarios, like Mark asked about there, we do also provide an API. And this programmatic API, this allows you to interact, basically do the same thing that we're doing in the test script, but you're doing it via code. And the syntax, I think, is what you might expect. You basically just send it a message which represents the utterance that you want to say. And then you get back a result that has essentially all the elements on it that you saw in that YAML. So you can test the transcript, you can test the card, you can test all the other aspects of the JSON that come back. And so that's really handy. If you're just writing basic sequential tests, even if you're a programmer, we sort of encourage you to use the YAML. It's very easy to work with. But where this is neat is, let's say that you want to do a scenario where you're doing some deep slot testing. So if you think about a travel app where you have many destinations that people might go to, you know, many cities that people might name or locations, or if you think about like a music app where there's many songs or artists that somebody might request, you want to test and make sure that it's recognizing those things correctly. Well, in that case, you could use this. You can use our programmatic API, load in all the potential scenarios that you want to test into a text file, and then just take those out and write a simple for loop that just runs them through one after the other, or even runs them through in parallel to do it rather quickly. And if you do that, the nice thing is that you can very easily do that sort of deeper testing with a real minimum of work, and without writing them all out in the way, writing out 100 different slot values in this sort of test, that's rather inefficient. So that's a nice case. Additionally, if you wanted to run through all those different poly scenarios, I don't know if there's an API that lists the poly voices. I mean, there probably is actually. I'm not certain about that. But you could just put the list of all these voices, into an array. And run them through with the different scenarios that you have. And I will say, if you wanted to combine together a long script that you wrote here with all the different poly voices, I mean, you could write that code in, I don't know, 10 lines. I mean, it's very straightforward to kind of combine the two approaches. So it's really a nice thing that you can do there. Very, very easy to work with. So this programmatic API, it's not going to be for everyone, but for more complex scenarios, it's something to keep in mind, and it allows you relatively easily to cover some, even trickier scenarios, and really something to keep in mind. Just going back to our presentation here. Yeah, so I covered most of what I wanted to with the end-to-end testing. Before we get to the sort of dedicated question part, I did just want to talk about our monitoring and continuous testing. So with that, I'm going to flip over here to our dashboard. There's a lot of really cool stuff in our dashboard. I encourage you all to sign up and check this out. Right now, what I want to just highlight for you is our validation feature, which should look sort of similar to what we were just showing you with the YAML. It's not quite the same syntax, but the basic idea is the same, which is that you're giving us an input and an expected output, and we're going to test it. So very simple there. This syntax here is not as sophisticated as the YAML, but it allows you to run through a sequence of interactions. And what I would highlight about this that's really cool is that you can enable monitoring, which I've already done. And with that, this script that you have here is going to be run on a 30-minute interval. And that's a really useful thing. So by running it on a regular basis, you're not doing all the deep testing that you might do with a test script project like this, but you can test some key scenarios, make sure that they're running correctly, make sure that nothing has gone wrong with the code, nothing has gone wrong with your database or other environmental things, make sure there's no problems with Alexa. There are some outages that Amazon's had. If you have any problems with those pieces, we're going to alert you. You'll get an email and you'll know that there's an issue, and you can address it right away. And that's going to help you in terms of avoiding getting bad reviews for your skill. It's helpful in terms of fixing any bugs that come up proactively. It's a great way to really have confidence that your code is working correctly. And we really see this working hand in hand with the sort of deeper scripts that you can write with the end-to-end test that I was showing you. And the sort of idea is, you're using the test scripts during development in QA. So you put together your deeper test scripts. You're running those as you're developing the skill. You're running them as you're doing quality assurance on it. Once you actually get it live, then you go ahead and you set up the monitoring. So it's doing a simpler set of tests on that regular 30-minute interval. And then in addition to that, you can also be running those full deep test scripts on a daily or weekly basis. And that's to give you even more confidence. But so you can bring all those pieces together rather easily so that you have really total assurance that your skill is working correctly. And we think that's a really awesome thing. It's really not very hard to set up. Bo and I are working on better marketing pitches, but the best one I've come up with so far for this is why not? And the reason I say that is we try to make this easy enough. It's why would you not use this? If you put the effort in to build your skill, to build your voice app, you do want to make sure it's working correctly. And we think we've made it easy enough that you can set it up and get this extra assurance with really a minimum of effort. And it's a great thing for your skill and for any people that you might have developed it for. I would also just mention that one thing that we're getting into is actually providing testing as a service. So if you want us to help you do the quality assurance for your skill, just reach out to us. We'd be happy to have a conversation about this. So that's an overview of what we do for end-to-end testing and some of the best practices that we recommend for it. You'll notice at the end of this presentation, which, as I mentioned before, we're going to email this out. We have links to, I think, almost everything that I mentioned here. I alluded to some of our other webinars. You can see those on our YouTube channel. Oh, I didn't show this. Nope. The documentation for the test scripting is available here. I covered a lot of the elements, but this is the reference docs for it. So everything that I've talked about, you can see here, and also contact info on Twitter. You can find, absolutely reach out to us with any questions at all. So at this point, just throw it open to questions from the group. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And okay, so Nate asks, in regard to the monitoring, does that end up being logged on the measure section of the skill dev page? Yes, so in terms of the results of the monitoring, that does. Now, sort of anticipating what you might also be thinking about, we have a logging feature, which is awesome. You do need to do an integration with your skill. We have a simple to use, easy to use SDK that you bring into your skill. And with that, you get all the detailed logging info. And then you get even more information based on that. Are there any possibilities to test simulate when someone is not speaking clearly? Again and again, I have problems that Alexa recognizes words that sound similar to others, but which are assigned a completely different intent in my skill. Tobias, so you can do that by playing around with the different poly voices and playing around with different words. That specific scenario you're talking about, I would say that relates to things that we plan to develop but have not yet. There's two ways I could think of to handle that. One is with Poly, there's an SSML capability which allows you to modify the sound of the voice in a way that I think would get to a less distinct speaker. Additionally, a really decisive solution to that is to actually record audio that's exactly what you think is the problematic scenario and send that through our engine. We have not done that yet, but that is something that's on our roadmap, and we do plan to add. Given all the pieces we've put in place, it's a pretty small step to get from where we are to supporting those things. But today, my best advice would be to try to play around, use different words that sound like the one that's a problem, use different voices, and I think you can tease out some of those scenarios today with what we have. So the vendor ID, One, fortunately, with the next version of our software that's coming out next week, you don't have to put in the vendor ID, which is that's a nice thing that we don't have to burden people with. But the vendor ID goes here, so you paste it into this spot. And oh, sorry, not showing the screen. I didn't go into great depth on setting up the monitoring. We do try to make it as easy to use as possible, but we have seen people have some issues setting it up. Our next webinar is going to be dedicated to setting up monitoring on skills. So we'll cover things like this, but the vendor ID goes right here. And yeah, other questions? So I should ask some questions, I guess, to make it more interactive. How many of you are currently doing or have dedicated QA phases for your skills as part of your development phase? Sammy, you do? That's great. And what aspects, if you don't mind sharing, do you guys struggle with the most? Time for yeah, okay. Well, I think we can help you with that. You know, running through this the test manually is very burdensome. I think you basically can cut the time down from, if you have a complex skill, you know, we actually did a great project with Mercedes recently. And I think we cut down the testing time from like 2 days to, you know, 10 minutes. Now, not everybody does it take 2 days to go through things. But, you know, even if it takes you 2 or 3 hours to cut that down, you know, 5 or 10 minutes, that's obviously a huge win. And it allows you to focus on the more complex scenarios, as opposed to just, you know, just trying to make sure that the core stuff works. Other questions? I see some people typing. Nate, you say building unit tests that progress through Nintendo has been a struggle for me. I would definitely encourage you to check out our virtual Alexa project. I don't have that pulled up, but you can see some of the unit tests that we write there, or so, you know, unit tests we put together here. It works very nicely. It's an emulator, and it just means that we're not actually using Alexa. We're producing JSON that looks like Alexa. And by doing that, you don't have to do the whole deployment. You don't have to set up all your interaction model in the console. You can just do it all locally. And that really saves you an immense amount of time. You know, that's the unit testing and the end-to-end testing. They cover different things, but we see them as very complementary. coverage for all possible outputs, decision points of the skill. I mean, that, gosh, we have this idea in mind that we're going to build something that looks at your interaction model and just, basically pulls that in and uses that to run tests against it. But even then, we can't foresee every potential path through the skill. I do think that's a matter of mapping it out. Now, on the unit testing side, though, actually, we may have a way to do that. That actually gives me an idea. But for unit testing, you can quite clearly see, or you can see very well that you covered your scenarios by using those code coverage tools. So I think if you look at the code cover, the unit testing plus the code coverage, I think you'd find, you still could miss a scenario that's always, it's hard to say that you get 100%, but the code coverage is going to give you a good amount of confidence that you've covered, 95 to 99% of the scenarios, because it's going to show you that all the lines of code are being executed. And I see a question with the upcoming version of BVD. Will it require granting of specific permissions of our Amazon dev account? We do require that. So you do have to go through and create a virtual device that links to your Amazon account today. And we need access to it to do that. That's basically fundamental to how it works. So we have one that we did on unit testing. I'll show you that. These are the replays of the webinars on unit testing. It's the same webinar. We did 2 that week. One of them is probably better than the other, probably the 23rd. Whichever one I do in our morning is usually the worst one, I'm sorry to say, because I'm not as alert in the morning. But that goes to our unit testing tools. Definitely feel free to reach out if you have questions on how to use that. We're biased, but we think it's really pretty awesome. So yeah, you can watch that one. Oh, right. Sorry. I meant to share my screen there. Here's the YouTube. And we have the link to the YouTube in the presentation, but this is what I was referring to when I thought I was sharing my screen a moment ago. Those are the webinars that we did on unit testing. We'll keep this open if there's more questions. Just when we have a few minutes left, it's definitely a tangent. This is not normally what we talk about at the end. But if you guys hadn't seen this, I thought this was really neat. Amazon just came out with this blueprints. We were talking about it this morning. I don't think this really has anything to do with us. I don't see people really doing a lot of testing on this. But it looks like this is a way to build just sort of personal skills to share with your family. Really nice, easy to set up. It's kind of like a script writer syntax. I think it just shows the potential for these platforms. I mean, it looks like anybody could come in here and just create a skill to share with their family, share with their children. Just really cool. I think it's one more reason to be excited about this platform. in the whole space. I believe this just came out this morning. Really, really a neat thing. Worth taking a look at. All right, guys. Well, if there's not any more questions, we'll wrap this up. But really appreciate everyone's participation. Hope you found it useful, and we'll have some follow-ups for you. But really appreciate you joining, and definitely reach out if you have more questions. You know it all. So thanks a lot.